everyone, welcome to the new video. So today we will see Azure interview questions and answers. So I will also compile these questions and answers and I'll put this in a GitHub repo which I'll provide it in description box. But yeah, let's discuss whatever we can discuss in the span of time. So yeah, let's start. So first question is, what is Microsoft Azure? So you can, you know, I have given the answer also. You can go through that. It's not like, we should know these many services or this also we should know, this also we should know, we should cover maximum service. It's not like that. Whatever services you know, you should be pitch perfect in that. Whatever our questions are asked, you are able to answer around it. So, what is a resource group? Resource group is a logical container for Azure resources. So, there are different resource group that you can create for different environment, for different teams. So, it's like a boundary, management boundary. Then, what is Azure subscription? So, there is a level tenant management group subscription. That resource group comes, and under the resource we have resources. So subscription provide billing boundary, resource boundary, access control boundary, quota boundary. What is Microsoft intra id? Like, it's this used to be called Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, and then intra id is Azure Identity and Access Management Service. Then RBAC versus intra id basically deals with identity and authentication. Azure RBAC. So basically, intra id is identity and authentication, but RBAC is like what we are authorized to do, what we can do. We can, either create it or what access we have. It's for RBAC. So intra id is very important to know. Like, we have intra id basically in Azure to manage the identity and authentication of the you know resources in Azure. What is Azure RBAC? So it's like role based access control. Like, we have reader, we have contributor, we have owner, we have ACR push, ACR pull, these kind of access. So good practices, least privilege. Managed identity is basically that which allow Azure resource to authenticate to other Azure services without storing credentials such as password or client secret. So we just have to give the client ID, the tenant ID, and the subscription, and we'll be able to connect to that Azure service using managed ID. So basically, we mostly use managed ID, and there are two types of managed ID: system assigned and user assigned. So system assigned is basically it is created together with Azure resource, and once this resource is deleted, the ID goes. But the user assigned identity is created separately, and that can be used to multiple connect to, or authenticate to multiple resources. So what is managed identity better than, why is managed identity better than not storing Azure credential? Because credentials can be hacked, or they can be exposed, or but Azure credentials uh, will not be compromised. Okay, basically we are not using any credentials in that. So how would an application running on AKS access key running on AKS access key vault? So how it will, like, most good answer will be to use the managed identity based approach rather than putting Azure credential inside the pod. So this will be the flow. What is Azure key vault? To store the secret, certificates, encryption key. And what is Azure virtual network? Is the foundation of private networking in Azure, which will have subnets. What is subnet? What is NSG? NSG is to control the inbound and outbound traffic. NSG versus Azure firewall. So primarily provides at the network traffic filtering at the subnet or NIC level. By Azure firewall, it's like manage centralized network security with more advanced capabilities. So what is Azure load balancer? What is application gateway versus load balancer? What is Azure front door? Okay. TLS termination help base. What is AKS? AKS architecture. So there is control plane which will be managed by Azure itself. There will be node pools at which we will manage. So what all components are there in control plane, we can discuss. What is AKS node pool? So node pool is a group of Kubernetes nodes with particular VM configuration. We have system node pool, we have user node pool, we have core Kubernetes workload, application workloads. We can create different node pool for workloads with different requirements. What is AKS scaling? HPA and cluster autoscaler. And KEDA is can scale workloads based on event driven metrics such as queues. So what happens if an AKS pod can't be scheduled? So how will be our troubleshooting? We will investigate CPU memory taints, toleration, node selector, affinity, PVC, availability constraint or resource quotas. What is Azure Container Registry? It's a Azure private container registry where we can store the images. How does AKS pull images from ACR? So basically, we have to give AKS permission of ACR pull. How would you build a CI/CD architecture in Azure that we can tell? Then we can GitHub action is how we will do Azure authentication. So I prefer OIDC federation instead of storing a long live Azure client secret. So how it is done? The flow is OIDC token. The token will be used and it will be created using client ID, tenant ID, and subscription ID. And that token is for one sometime use, and then we can run our pipeline. So similarly, why use OIDC instead? Because client secret is a long live, we have to rotate it, but OIDC are short live federated authentication. So Azure monitor versus log analytics, and then comes how would you troubleshoot an application in AKS. So basically, where it is failing, like on the UI level, or on the network level, or on the application side. The Azure storage question. What is storage account? That we can. What is a private endpoint? So basically, when we want to privately access any Azure service, so we can create a private endpoint which will give a private IP address in your VNet to connect to an Azure PaaS service. So this service isn't necessarily exposed to a public endpoint for that access, but this is an important enterprise cloud security concept. So private endpoint versus service endpoint. So service endpoint is like extend VNet identity to Azure services over Azure's backbone. Like, and then it provides a private VNet for the service. What is Azure DNS? Okay, it's like managing the DNSs. What is Azure managed is, what is VM scale sets, what are Azure availability zones, what is region versus availability zones, what is disaster recovery, and then what is Azure security architecture, Terraform plus Azure, that we can see. Then Terraform state in Azure, how we store the state file like in blob container. And there is you would also want access control encryption state locking where supported by the chosen backend or version restricted access and version recovery option. Azure DevOps versus GitHub Actions, Azure DevOps pipeline. Then what is Azure application insight? Basically to get the application performance insight using Azure Monitor. How would you monitor AKS? Then these are the things. How would you secure an AKS cluster? I'd use identity based access to intra-ID, Kubernetes RBAC, and Azure RBAC. Then what is Azure policy? So basically I'll give you Azure policy versus RBAC. So like RBAC is John cannot delete AKS, but policy is resources must have required tags. So RBAC is basically what all we can perform, but and what all we cannot do. But policy is like these are allowed and these are to be done. Okay, these are allowed or these are required. What is Azure landing zone? They address things such as identity, networking, governance. So for an enterprise like a large healthcare organization, the concept is particularly relevant when we are designing our enterprise environment. Azure healthcare environment, how to design it. Azure application suddenly becomes unavailable, then cannot access key vault, then cannot pull image. Okay. And then Terraform pipeline cannot authenticate to Azure, and then application is slow but infrastructure looks healthy. How will we do? So yeah, these are all the questions. I'll put it in that GitHub repo, and the link will be in description box. You can check it out. So yeah, that's all. So that's all for today's video. I hope it's helpful. Please let me know your views in the comment section. Till then, take care. Bye.